Well, welcome to this month's Ask Your Herb Doctor, KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM, and on the web at www.kmud.org. We're also live streaming this program to our Western Botanical Medicine YouTube channel, so you can listen live right now on our channel by searching Western Botanical Medicine in the search bar on YouTube and clicking on the live stream. Tonight's radio show is a discussion of the endocrine hormone system, part 2, and the herbal medicines that modulate this system. My name's Andrew Murray.
My name's Sarah Johannesson Murray. Welcome.
We're both licensed medical herbalists who consult with clients with a wide range of conditions. Basically, I studied an undergraduate degree in botany, a 3-year program in which my middle year placement was at Cambridge University Botanic Gardens in England. And it was there that I became interested in the aspects of medicinal plant cultivation whilst working under glass, and continued my undergrad degree by doing another 4-year degree in herbal medicine, graduating with the University of Cardiff in Wales from a 4-year program in what was called phytotherapy. So that was a course that was basically enabling us to become licensed to diagnose and prescribe and insured, etc., just like a naturopath, naturopathic doctor here in the States. So essentially, we are naturopaths and operating under the legal framework that California allows from the Health Freedom Initiative. So thank you, California. So you can visit our site to see a list of organic herbal tinctures and our contact details. Alternatively, we can be reached on our toll-free number, 1-888-WBM-HERB. Our Western Botanical Medicine Twitter account's handle is at WBM-HERB. And we will be posting any future news continuing regarding the family's effort to preserve Raymond Pete's published and unpublished works for generations to come on our Twitter page. So please be patient and stay connected with us on Twitter. We'll also be tweeting upcoming Ask Your Herb Doctor announcements and more. And there is still a massive amount of work behind the scenes here to get all of the radio shows edited and cleaned up and put up on our YouTube channel. So it's all still happening. Believe me, there's a lot of other stuff happening too, but so bear with us. As always, the show is a live call-in show from 7:30 until 8 o'clock. And the number here, you're encouraged to call in with any questions related or unrelated to the endocrine system, but hopefully related to herbal medicine, alternative medicine. That number is 707-923-3911. Once again, 707-923-3911, and we'll be taking callers from 7:30 on. So essentially, last month was the beginning of, I think, what will become somewhat of a kind of a study course, if you like, giving an overview of bodily systems and herbs to treat different conditions that have been used empirically for a long time, and which are very well supported by published empirical science. Dr. Pete, God bless him, was very science-based and very alternative. So the two go hand in hand, and don't believe that what your drug rep tells you about certain drugs is necessarily the whole story about it, and do your own research, because a wiser man listens to many different inputs, and so therefore people can do research and find out what we're talking about and corroborate what we're explaining here. So last month I kind of finished up with polycystic ovarian syndrome as part of an endocrine disorder, and just wanted to remind and reiterate some of the salient parts of that discourse, just to for women who are listening, just so that you can understand the inherent problems with PCOS and what you can do about it. So don't leave it untreated. There's plenty of options for you, lots of alternative medicine options that will work very effectively to reverse PCOS without the use of drugs or blocking agents. So the research that has been done has shown that women with PCOS are at 3 times higher risk for endometrial cancer, 2 times higher risk for ovarian cancer, and 2 to 4 times higher risk for breast cancer. Now, all of these are the metabolically active proceeds of estrogen and estrogen dominance. Estrogen is a proliferative hormone, and unfortunately, too much good review has been ascribed to estrogen, and it's completely back to front in terms of the science, in terms of the research, and especially in terms of the estrogen industry and the multi-billion-dollar drug-based business behind estrogen. Progesterone, the antagonist to estrogen, which is the anti-inflammatory, life-promoting, energy restorative youth hormone that women experience during pregnancy. When people tell the pregnant woman who's in the first or second trimester how well, I guess once they've got over the morning sickness, but when they're looking radiant and they feel good and their hair is doing great and their nails are growing and the skin is glowing and they have this youthful kind of glow and feel, that's progesterone. It's not estrogen. So the industry has very much promoted estrogen as a quote unquote hormone to counteract the effects of the menopause and to promote bone rebuilding during osteoporosis, to prevent osteoporosis. And actually, the scientific research, it shows the opposite, that estrogen actually is very damaging, very cancer promoting, and that women who use estrogen are much more likely to suffer from those cancers that estrogen drives and fuels. The point of PCOS is that it can be treated, and it is an estrogenic problem in the heart of it, and that several other conditions go along with PCOS, this polycystic ovarian syndrome. The oxidative stress can lead to what they call hyperandrogenism. So this is the androgens that typically in females are not that visibly displayed. So testosterone can manifest itself in some females here with PCOS, and facial hair growth can certainly be evident with women suffering from PCOS as a result of this hyperandrogenism. And insulin resistance in its own right can also develop, producing obesity with it. Just to say that the possibility of a heart attack is 4 to 7 times more in women with PCOS than those without PCOS, and around 50% of women with polycystic ovarian syndrome suffer from obesity. And obesity is perhaps the main reason behind these women commonly developing temporary cessation of breathing during sleep, known as obstructive sleep disorder. I think many people in the world, not just because of PCOS, but those who suffer with sleep apnea, probably don't even realize they have sleep apnea if they're sleeping next to their husband, their spouse, their wife, whatever. Maybe that person tells them, hey, you were choking on your tongue last night, or you're snoring a lot, and this kind of complaints about the sleep being disrupted like that can be due to apnea. And that apnea in its own right can really produce a very degraded quality of life. Anyway, that's another subject down the road, but just to mention that obstructive sleep disorder is also much more common in women suffering with PCOS. Now, we've mentioned that obesity in women with PCOS exists, but it can be controlled to some extent by diet and regular physical activity. And it's also been observed from the published literature that PCOS is the leading cause of metabolic syndrome, that is heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure. And with progesterone's use and the treatment outlined for estrogen dominance, this can mitigate the condition. So, wrap up PCOS.
Yes, polycystic ovarian syndrome is a failure of the ovaries to ovulate properly, producing viable ovarian progesterone production. And mentioning about the obesity in there, when a woman has PCOS, they usually have problems with their weight because of the insulin resistance that you were mentioning there, Andrew.
Mhm.
And what happens there, just to try to explain how important it is for a woman with PCOS to try to lose the weight, which is very difficult in a woman with PCOS because of that insulin resistance. But the adipose tissue, the fat cells, store extra estrogen. Already the ovaries are not producing the progesterone properly from the corpus luteum, and the estrogen is elevating, and the fat cells will store that estrogen and release it and continue the vicious cycle of preventing ovulation. It's almost like taking the oral contraceptive pill. You're constantly getting a release of estrogen from the adipose tissue that stops the production of normal cycle coming from the ovaries. So it's really important to try to mitigate the estrogen through all the different methods Andrew was mentioning and encourage healthy normal ovulation. And I know you're going to talk about some herbs that are useful for polycystic ovaries. I know last month we mentioned Vitex and chaste-berry being very useful in stimulating normal ovulation. Another herb is white peony root. It's very effective at stimulating normal ovulation, and specifically for polycystic ovarian syndrome, which Andrew's abbreviated to PCOS.
Okay, thanks for that. I want to just quickly put in there that estrogen is also not just produced by the ovaries. It's actually produced by almost every, I think Dr. Pete would say that every cell has the ability to produce and secrete estrogen, especially during inflammation. So any damaged area, even cuts and traumas, any site of injury, the cell's natural response to that injury is to secrete estrogen. So that's actually a very widespread production. So when you go into a situation where your progesterone level has dropped, so you're no longer really producing progesterone, you're still massively producing estrogen, whether you like it or not. And so therefore, using substances like pregnenolone that can be converted into progesterone, or using progesterone directly, will help counteract the pro-inflammatory effects of estrogen down the road.
And the body's response to produce estrogen in response to physical injury, radiation damage, that's the main thing that damages your cells in your DNA when you're exposed to ionizing radiation, is that it causes the cells to produce estrogen, and those cells also produce serotonin, and that is what is poisoning the whole system and damaging the DNA. And what I was going to say about that is that the cells that are producing the estrogen in the short term, it's useful. That's why the body does it, to try to mitigate the inflammation. But what happens when you're exposed to continuous ionizing radiation and continuous physical damage to your cells and continuous stressors, the estrogen levels elevate, and it does get stored in the adipose tissue. I don't know if that's making sense for the listeners here, but I just wanted to explain that the body produces estrogen in the short term to try to help heal the damage. But what happens when people are continually exposed to damaging, stressing chemicals, radiation, and physical injury, or just chronic inflammation, then it becomes a problem.
Okay, so looking at a couple of medicinal herbs along the lines of menstrual irregularity, dysregulation. The first one I want to talk about, not extensively, because it's one of those herbs that I wouldn't recommend most lay people would get involved with in any serious level, just because it is relatively toxic. And so to take it carefully and not just think you can just drink large amounts of this product without any ill effect, because herbs, even though they're herbs, some of them have very profound effects. And one of the best uses for medicinal herbs is to affect the endocrine system. I want to talk a little bit later on, a very short kind of passage about endocrine disruptors. We've done lots of shows with Ray about it, on plastics, petrochemicals, hormones, that we come into contact with in picogram levels, concentrations of 10 to the minus 12, actually have profound physiological effects. And so these xenoestrogens in the environment and other estrogen mimics have very profound effects, especially on females' bodies. But just to say that this plant, blue cohosh, it's definitely been popular in the American literature, and so it is one of our native US herbs, and definitely for gynecological disorders. So essentially, it's a native, not actually Western, but it's Eastern and Central United States. It's been traditionally used as well as historically used as a anticonvulsant mainly, but it's used as an anti-rheumatic, as a fever-lowering herb. It's actually been used as an emetic, so therefore to make you vomit. And it's also been used as a sedative, but most notably as a gynecological aid. So kind of hear us out here. It's something I don't want people just to jump into and use, because it's not a schedule, what they call now a Schedule 20 herb, where it's practitioner only. I think you can probably get a hold of blue cohosh extract pretty much anywhere. I think the kind of leading manufacturers of medicinal plant extracts produce an extract of blue cohosh. But essentially, it's used for labor induction. Now, for women that have difficulty in labor and they're not getting good enough, strong enough, regular contractions. Now, Sarah, maybe you want to weigh in on this perhaps, but it's definitely been used for the induction of labor. But it's also been used for a condition called amenorrhea, which is absent menstruation, and dysmenorrhea, which is a painful menstruation that's typically would almost be related to estrogen excess, where the inflammatory effects of estrogen cause that cramping, that uterine cramping, and the pain and or the heavy bleeding and clots that some women get with their cycle if they're unlucky.
Yeah, a lot of these female herbs are also have a use in rheumatism and as anti-inflammatories, and that's because their compound is a steroidal saponin, and that's an anti-inflammatory compound that works on the adrenal glands, as well as on the female hormones, as well as for men. They're still anti-inflammatory. It's not like they're feminizing. So they're having their anti-inflammatory effect is how I like to look at these herbs, but specifically to help with the inflammation of rheumatism, or specifically to help with the inflammation in the ovaries that could be causing an amenorrhea, which is a lack of cycling.
Okay, so as I mentioned initially, to use with caution, because the other thing that's noteworthy about it is that it is an abortifacient, so it's an abortion inducer, and may well have been used, as a means by which to give abortion, but that is definitely not something that we would recommend or consider in any way. Now,
so when you're in labor and you need to speed up the strength of the contractions, speed
right,
up the rate of contraction and the
used.
strength, then
Yeah.
it's an appropriate use for blue cohosh.
Okay, so it was official in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1882 to 1905 for the induction of labor, and in the National Formulary from 1916 to 1950. And blue cohosh is listed in the British Herbal Pharmacopoeia of 1983, used as a spasmolytic to break the spasms of cramping and contraction, and as an emmenagogue. So hastening menstruation. But like I said, it's not to be used except with professional consultation with a licensed herbalist, rather than self-managing with something like that, because it can have fairly serious consequences, especially in any overdose amount. Okay, so to move on to the next herb, again, another US native, wild yam, aka Dioscorea villosa. This is recommended for menopausal symptoms and menstrual complaints. And diosgenin is commonly seen as the active ingredient and is an aglycone, that is the non-sugar fragment of a glycoside, a sugar and a non-sugar fraction bound together. The main component appears to be diosgenin, and a variety of molecules which are diosgenin bound to different glycosides, as well as other steroidal saponins, which appear to exist in this species of yam, including a product called zingiberensis saponin, probably notably known from being present in Zingiber officinalis, the regular ginger, and then diosin and diaryl heptanoid compounds, and a substance called parvifloside. Now, there are other furostanols and other chemical names. There's no point spelling them out because they're not that relevant, but essentially, studies of overectomized mice to mimic the menopause, as it were, failed to find significant alteration in the uterine weight associated with the intake of 9.8 to 37.7 milligrams per kilo of diosgenin over a period of 20 weeks, suggesting a lack of estrogenic effects. Now, we've had shows in the past where we've talked about phytoestrogens, and obviously, a lot of herbalists worldwide, and when we studied, phytoestrogens were where it was all at. And the rationale given then, and we've had discussions with Ray Pete about this, that they are not strongly estrogenic because they are phytoestrogens. They have a similar molecular shape where they can bind to an estrogen receptor and occupy it, which is the thing that they want to do, but they do not elicit a strong estrogenic effect, which is not what you want. So they can be used and have been used, and that's the rationale behind using any of these quote-unquote phytoestrogenic plants, of which Simicifuga racemosa, which we'll look at in a bit, black cohosh, and wild yam, and several others have been proposed as the mechanism by which they're having this beneficial effect, whilst at the same time being a binding agent for an estrogen receptor. But that's just mainly to neutralize it and block it.
So basically, when you use phytoestrogens, if you're a Ray Pete follower, you might think, oh, I don't want a phytoestrogen because I don't want anything that's estrogenic. But what happens with these plants? They're actually like estrogen blockers, like Andrew was explaining, because they block the receptor from your own body's estrogen that you might be producing from excessive stress or excessive radiation. And then you actually get a decreased estrogenic effect in your system. So they are useful for helping lower estrogen, along with all the other ways to help lower estrogen, like eating your raw carrot salad, staying away from stress, staying away from inflammation, eating a diet that's clean of PUFAs. PUFAs are very, very estrogenic, polyunsaturated fatty acids, vegetable oils. Omega-6 is very, very estrogenic and poisons the liver's excretion of estrogen, as well as being estrogenic in and of themselves.
So the other group of compounds in wild yam, which we've mentioned in the past and which come up time and time again in many different herbs, are the steroidal saponins. And these would typically be illustrated in a classroom setting by getting a liquid extract of this product in a test tube where it's easily seen, and it can be shaken. And it produces what they call a persistent foam. So, if you shake a liquid up and down, you get a small amount of foam and the bubbles quickly disappear. Well, steroidal saponins have this quality like soap, and that's where the term saponin comes from. This substance, it mimics this kind of soap in its phytochemistry. And when you shake this product, it can take minutes or even longer, 10, 15 minutes for the foam to disappear. So these steroidal saponins there are typically present in this group of phyto plants that exhibit these steroidal saponins, of which there are many. But just to say that Dioscorea is one of them. And also, the other substances that wild yam contains are things like terpenoids. And these terpenoids are built up of many different subunits. And the mint family, actually, the Labiatae, exhibit a lot of these terpenoids, so triterpenes, monoterpenes, diterpenes. And as I said, these phytochemicals are widely distributed in nature and an important part of plant-based functional foods with extensive biological activities, including anti-tumor, antifungal, and immune regulatory properties with a protective effect against cardiovascular disease.
Because they're blocking estrogen. Again, they're phytoestrogens, or they're acting like pregnenolone, and pregnenolone can help to block estrogen.
So the targets of saponins, as we've mentioned, present in plant-based functional foods and including diosgenin from yam, are extensive, and therefore these compounds also manage hyperlipidemia, which is an increase in lipids within the blood. And this is something else I just wanted to bring out for those people perhaps who have high cholesterol. But again, not to be knee-jerk about this or reactive to it, because it's actually good for people over 50 to have a cholesterol of 200, if not a little more. 210 or 220 even is actually been shown to be very protective against neurodegenerative disease, which happens typically when cholesterol is lowered, especially artificially with statins. So it's been purported that these saponins within wild yam have this activity by directly inhibiting endogenous, our own self, cholesterol biosynthesis. And these saponin compounds also regulate metabolism, the redistribution, the transport and excretion of lipids, as well as the gut microbiota, which also has another effect on cholesterol. And as Sarah was talking about carrot salad, just to reiterate that when your bowels are expelling waste efficiently and you're not holding onto it for any length of time, you won't reabsorb products from the bowel like cholesterol. Typically, this can be reshunted via the hepatic shunt. The liver will pick this up again and reintroduce it into the bloodstream. But ultimately, if your bowels are working effectively, not just estrogen, but excess cholesterol can also be lost through the bowel. There's no lack of cholesterol typically, unless you're using steroids, you're using statins, and you should never try to lower it artificially because it's actually very protective for you. So just to say that the underlying mechanism involved, the inhibition of cholesterol absorption, the promotion of cholesterol secretion, and the improvement of lipid distribution and regulation of oxidative stress, again, which is very important in the production of these pro-inflammatory mediators that cause dysregulation of metabolic processes.
But back to polycystic ovarian syndrome, another thing that you'll find with people with PCOS, or ladies with PCOS, is that they can tend to have elevated triglycerides. So that's also because of the insulin resistance and the complication there. So there's just a little side note on practically when you would find elevated triglycerides in a female hormone imbalance situation.
Okay, so you're listening to Ask Your Herb Dr. KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM from now until 8 o'clock. Callers are invited to call in with any questions, either related to the subject of endocrinology, female hormones, and just endocrine modulating herbs in general. Obviously, the guys are involved there too with testosterone production, and we're going to get to that in a bit. But obviously, there's many different facets of it, and the main outline of this is just to educate people out there, to let them know that there are plenty of alternatives that can totally make people healthier than they are. So the number's 707-923-3911, and we'll be keeping these lines open till 8 o'clock. Okay, so there were two other herbs, and I'm going to kind of interject with these two others as we carry on this subject. The first one, black cohosh, and then withania, which is ashwagandha. So mentioned endocrine disruptors briefly here at the beginning, and these are compounds in the environment, like things like tobacco smoke, pesticides, herbicides, plastics, flame retardants, and fragrances as well in lotions and cleaning supplies. And these all cause hormonal imbalances in picogram concentrations. So infinitesimally small concentrations of these have a significant stimulatory effect, especially for females. I think females are potentially more at risk purely because of the negative effects of estrogen that they have to cope with, which they are able to when they get a good menstrual cycle with the anti-inflammatory effects of progesterone. But thereafter, from menopause on, there can be a lot of problems occurring, and osteoporosis is not estrogen does not benefit osteoporosis. It's the other way around. But I think we have a caller, so let's take this first caller and let's see where we're going with the questions. Caller, you're on the air. Where are you from? What's your question?
Hi, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I have a question. I have a couple of family members that have a difficult time having children, and they do have PCOS. What would you say to them, or what are your thoughts on that?
Sarah?
And well, the first thing I'd want to do if a client came to me with PCOS is go over their diet, because that's so important to get the estrogen and the endocrine disrupting foods out of the body with a good diet, and get the cortisol down, because that's also a big promoter of PCOS because of the stress on the ovaries. And herbs like Vitex and white peony how I would be treating that herbally. Maybe some licorice if they are very cortisol dominant. Pregnenolone is also very helpful. Progesterone, definitely. Cycled from ovulation to menstruation. I'd also be looking at ultrasounds of their ovaries to see what is going on there and how serious a PCOS is. And there are also medications such as naltrexone that can be used, low-dose naltrexone, to stimulate ovulation, especially with the very, very resistant PCOS situations. So that's just kind of like a brief summary of what I would do if a client came to me with PCOS. I'd look at really cleaning up the diet first, though.
Wow, thank you so much. And can I ask one more question?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on anemia, and what would you tell a female if she is low iron?
So anemia often gets misdiagnosed as basic malnutrition is how I would want to say it, because really, if you have someone that has been diagnosed with anemia and you have them, you look at their iron saturation. I've only ever seen one person with a low iron saturation, and that was someone who was donating blood every month, and their iron saturation got down to 10. It's usually between 20 and 40 when you do a blood test. And I know Dr. P always wanted people's iron saturation to be around 25 and not any higher than that, because iron is associated with so many degenerative diseases, heart disease, female disorders, immune diseases, cancer. It really interacts with a lot of things. It's a big oxidant. So it really causes a lot of inflammation. So you want to block iron, and you want to take antioxidants that block iron. But that would be the first thing I'd say. Well, do you actually have anemia, or do you have a malnutrition disorder that we need to look at? And that's done with a simple blood test called iron saturation.
And if it's in a female too, it depends. Male to female can be obviously reasons for it. In females that have a lot of dysmenorrhea and a lot of excessive bleeding, that obviously will lend itself to decreasing hemoglobin and iron thereof. So in males, it's usually not as common.
It's more common for males to have an increased iron saturation and to have too much iron. But even in a woman who does have heavy menstrual cycles, I mean, you can say that their heavy menstruation is because of hormone imbalance rather than their problems and their fatigue is because of lack of blood or lack of iron. You really have to look at that iron saturation in order to figure out, are they actually iron deficient, and is it going to help them with supplementation? Because supplementing with iron can be a very, very dangerous thing. And
you're much better off
a lot of times it's actually good that that's their body's way of protecting them by having such a heavy period to get rid of extra iron to try to help with the hormone imbalance that they have. So your body does things to try to balance out other problems. And usually when you have your hormones balanced, your heavy menstruation will lessen.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you for your call.
Thank you for your call.
Okay, the number here, if you're in the area or out of the area, doesn't matter, 707-923-3911 until 8 o'clock. So to carry on with the hypothalamic pituitary axis, I want to, well, actually, before we do that, let's just mention for the males out there listening, and it seems to have been a kind of one-sided female thing with menstrual cycles and menopauses and heavy bleeding and stuff like that. So I know the guys also, they want to get some airtime out there, and I can totally relate to that from a testosterone production point of view, because that's our best friend. Testosterone is what keeps us male, gives us our facial hair, gives us our gruff voice, gives us our muscles and our manliness, which is not to be denied, especially in this social justice warrior liberation age. Men need to be men and remain men and be proud of it too, because that's our biological inheritance.
And also, just as a good word for testosterone in females, if you do have polycystic ovarian syndrome, your body's backup mechanism to compensate for the failure of your ovaries to produce progesterone is that your body produces testosterone. And usually women who have a higher testosterone in polycystic ovarian syndrome situations, that testosterone actually protects their heart from the damaging effects of the estrogen and actually protects the woman. So it's another, the body always tries to find a way to compensate. And in women with high testosterone and facial hair, because of a failure of the ovaries to produce progesterone, which is the woman's best friend, progesterone protects you from the damaging effects of estrogen and protects your heart. But if your ovaries aren't making enough progesterone, your body, your adrenal glands will start producing testosterone that will be visible by facial hair growth.
Okay, so just to quickly mention two things, and one is nettle root urtica dioica. It has been used for a long time here for benign prostatic hypertrophy. And this is a condition that males may encounter as they get a little older, with obviously the nocturia and frequent urination being part of the problem. As the prostate tissue swells, the urethra which passes through it becomes compressed, and urine volume and flow rates decrease. Residual urine remains in the bladder. So getting up 2 or 3 or more times, 5 or 6 or 7 times even, I've heard some people talking about a night, is not uncommon and definitely can be treated. So let's not even think about prostate cancer as the driver, because a lot of the times it's not. A lot of the times it's a benign hypertrophy. So nettle root is one of those things that's been used for it, and saw palmetto again. You may or may not have been tired of hearing about saw palmetto and the saponins from that, which have been used in lots of research that's shown positive effects for reducing the effects of benign prostatic hypertrophy. So both of those two herbs, nettle root, again, its main reason is it can block estrogen production in its own right throughout the body by inhibiting the enzyme aromatase, and this converts testosterone here into estrogenic compounds. So let's talk about the hypothalamus, and we've mentioned so far the things that are kind of female-based. We're going to continue on with that a little bit, because it does seem to be a kind of somewhat female-oriented physiology. But GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone, this is secreted by the hypothalamus, but it stimulates the pituitary gland to produce follicle-stimulating hormone, otherwise known as FSH. And now this is the hormone that's responsible for starting follicle, or egg, the production of an egg development, causing the level of estrogen, the primary female hormone, to rise. Now, luteinizing hormone, the other reproductive pituitary hormone, aids in the egg maturation and provides the hormonal trigger to cause ovulation and the release of eggs from the ovary. These are collectively termed gonadotrophic hormones, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. As previously mentioned, in Chase Tree, we talked about last month, regulates prolactin and naturally balances estrogen to progesterone levels, especially in females with a deficient luteal phase. And we talked about this last week, where the typical healthy 28-day cycle will be punctuated mid-cycle at day 14. And then that would be basically ovulation and the prior rise in estrogen would fall off slowly as progesterone's production from the corpus would continue to rise maximally at about day 23 and then all the way to day 28, when without conception and a healthy fertilized egg implanting into the endometrium, the cycle would begin again and the endometrium sheds, and day 1 begins the first day of bleeding. So especially useful chase tree is for women with a deficient luteal phase, like a 5 or 4 day cycle, where they're not getting sufficient progesterone exposure to the 14 days of estrogen exposure, and the estrogen exposure they're getting after ovulation, even, because it's still present, it's just not in high amounts.
So that's where Vitex comes in as a really useful herb in monitoring and maintaining a healthy corpus luteum, so you don't get a deficient luteal phase, which is a shortened time from ovulation to menstruation.
So follicle stimulating hormone, and this stimulates the testes, this is for the guys out there, to produce sperm and to stimulate the ovaries in females to produce eggs and estrogen. So it works on both men and women. Now, LH induces ovulation and corpus luteum formation, as Sarah's mentioned, which is responsible for the production of progesterone. And it also stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. Now, in males, luteinizing hormone induces testosterone production, and inhibin, produced by the gonads, inhibits FSH in the pituitary as a feedback mechanism. So just to quickly go over the 2 types of cells, inhibin is a protein secreted by Sertoli cells in men in the testicles and by the granulosa cells in women. They both produce inhibin. It inhibits the synthesis and release of the follicle stimulating hormone in the pituitary gland and reduces the hypothalamic luteinizing hormone releasing hormone content. Now, the Sertoli cells produce a compound called anti-Mullerian hormone. So Mullerian, that was the person that discovered this, preventing the development of female genital structures so that males are continuing to be males. So there is this balancing act occurring in tandem biochemically to orchestrate a correctly functioning physiology for sperm and testosterone production in men, and follicle production and estrogen secretion in women. And the other cells are Leydig cells, which are the primary source of testosterone or androgens in males. Now, this physiology allows them to play a crucial role in many vital physiological processes in males, including sperm production or spermatogenesis, controlling sexual development, and maintaining secondary sexual characteristics and behaviors. So to just cover the worth of what is available at birth, women are born, and in fact, when they are developing as a fetus in the womb, they basically have the entire cohort of eggs, if you like to call them eggs, that they'll ever have. And they are no longer created, but there are only, out of all those millions of potential eggs that could potentially become fertilized, only very few of them, if any, for some women, ever get fertilized to produce offspring. So the ovaries contain several million immature eggs, and no new eggs will be developed. And these eggs are constantly undergoing a process of development and loss. Now, most will die without really reaching maturity. And the process of egg loss occurs at all times, including before birth, before puberty, while on birth control pills, and the ovary undergoes a constant process of egg depletion throughout its lifetime.
But Dr. Pete was always, since he was very aware of this physiological fact that you have plenty of follicles that can develop, he said that you can carry on menstruating until your 80s if the environment is right, because you have plenty of follicles. There's no lack of follicle. What we have, generally speaking, for women once they get into their 40s, is you have a rising estrogen that basically poisons the ovaries from producing viable follicles, and you stop menstruating and you go into menopause. But essentially, given the right circumstances, given the right environment, the ovaries could carry on producing follicles and keep the progesterone production up and keep your heart healthy and your bones healthy, and all those things that we associated with youth continue on well into your 80s.
Okay, so for the males,
And I have known someone that was still menstruating at 70, in their 70s.
okay, so for the males who are feeling a little left out here, let's talk about some of the testosterone boosting medicinal herbs that are used. I haven't actually produced an extensive list here, but just want to mention them in passing. So Tribulus terrestris, one of those southwest desert plants, grows in Arizona, New Mexico. It's essentially a weed, like a lot of herbs are weeds, but they have very profound effects, especially when you're concentrating them and you're producing extracts from them. So Tribulus terrestris, it's actually named Tribulus is trouble and terrestris is of the earth, because if you've ever seen this plant growing, which I have seen, and I have felt the sharp spines on the seeds of this plant. This plant has a fairly short life cycle in terms of it obviously doesn't get a lot of rain where it's used to growing. So it germinates and grows pretty quickly and sets seed fairly rapidly as part of its kind of evolutionary survival mechanism. But these seeds, again, about the size of a small pea, maybe 6 or 7 sided spines on them, regularly puncture tires. So
and it is actually the common name for Tribulus terrestris is puncture vine.
Puncture vine.
Because it has been known to puncture tires.
Yeah. So this plant, again, it's one of those plants that contains steroidosaponins and specifically will improve testosterone output in males as a feedback mechanism physiologically. So that's one of the kind of herbs that would be used in if people look at these, quote, I'm not promoting it, I'm just saying bodybuilding type anabolic agents. And Dr. Pete was never into anabolic herbs per se or stimulating anabolism, rather kind of cautious about that from its potential. I think his main tenet was the potential for a growth formation that is outside of the control of the organism. It's not being orchestrated correctly. But I think with good diet, good exercise, keeping oxidative stress down by not getting involved in aerobic exercise, but doing weight-bearing exercise. So with good diet, good exercise, and some of these herbs of which can promote and support testosterone production would definitely be very potentially positive for somebody, and the risk, quote unquote, risk of extra tissue manifestations outside of the control of the body would be fairly minimal.
I think basically muscle building exercises is a great way to stimulate healthy testosterone, and women who have too much estrogen and not enough progesterone, it also helps to lower the estrogen because it helps to lower the cortisol when you stimulate muscle building production. When you're working out, lifting weights and doing muscle building exercises, you're actually lowering your stress hormones, and it has been associated with increased longevity as well.
Okay, so let's talk about very briefly here, because I don't want to keep going on about the ginsengs and the ginseng saponins. Again, what we mentioned about steroidal saponins earlier on the show, the ginsengs contain a similar class of saponins that, if you get a ginseng extract and you shake it, you'll find a fairly persistent foam on the top, which is a pretty good indication that the plant contains steroidal saponins. So both ginsengs, in fact, most of them, even the Aralia, which is the California spikenard, or was known as the California ginseng, which does grow here on the Pacific West Coast, and which I do collect and gather, and we have growing on our property as a certified organic product that we do use in our triple ginseng formula. That the Aralia, as well as Panax ginseng, the Korean ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, the American ginseng, and then Eleutherococcus, which is not a ginseng, it's not a Panax, but I won't really include that, it's an adaptogen. But essentially the ginsengs have a very positive effect on testosterone and focus and concentration because they're switching on cyclic AMP, and that is responsible for adequate and correct metabolic functioning and turnover. So the ginsengs, and then people have probably heard about this product, horny goatweed. One of those Chinese herbs, and so that's definitely got lots of research done on it, plenty of advertising done on it. I think when it first came out, maybe 15 years ago, I think sales of horny goatweed, the epimedium, that is one of those Chinese herbs, again, for supporting testosterone production, was definitely well written about, and there was lots to be said for its positive effects on testosterone.
And also, I mean, back to the saw palmetto and the nettle root, is because those block estrogen, and estrogen blocks testosterone production. Those are also herbs that can increase your testosterone through a backup mechanism.
Okay, so let's see here. What else? So we've mentioned saw palmetto. We've mentioned the ginsengs, tribulus, horny goatweed. There are others, but let's continue here onto the exposition of anterior pituitary hormones and what we can do to modulate them. Okay, so growth hormone, that's something that people have probably heard about, especially for people with growth hormone defects and children, I think notably if they're very small stature and they don't seem to be growing well. Sometimes their pituitary is investigated and they see they have defects in growth hormone. But actually, we have a caller, so let me just stop right there. So let's take this next caller. You're on the air. Where are you from? What's your question?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, go ahead. Where are you from? What's your question?
I just had a quick question about hormone balance. And some of the ladies I've known who've had really difficult menstrual cycles, it seems to be related to emotional stress. And I was just wondering if you could have any comments on emotional stress and hormone balance, and I'll take my answer off the air.
How old is the person, just before you go?
I think we lost him, but I can answer that question. Basically, when you're stressed, your body initially produces a bunch of adrenaline, and then that stimulates cortisol. If you continue being stressed, emotionally stressed, physically stressed, whatever the stressor is, that high cortisol will stimulate estrogen, and the estrogen will block the ovaries' production of progesterone, and you'll have an imbalanced ratio of estrogen to progesterone. So it's very, very clear to see a pattern of a female being very stressed out and having decreased progesterone. You can get a blood test done to see this, and it's all through an excess of cortisol. So there's various different ways to try to stop the stress. There's lots of nervine herbs. You can try to stop the stress through the cortisol. I mean, you can try to stop the stress through trying to remove it, stop what it is that's stressing you. But if that's not possible, pregnenolone and all these different adaptogen herbs we've been talking about that act like pregnenolone actually help block the brain's production of cortisol, and then that can help lower the estrogen that causes a hormone imbalance. Taking progesterone from ovulation to menstruation can help to balance out and to increase the ovaries' production of progesterone, contrary to some trains of thought. Supplementing with natural progesterone in the second half of your cycle will actually increase your ovaries' production of progesterone and not decrease it.
Good point. Okay, so let's see here. We've got 6 minutes to. The number's 707-923-3911. I'm going to continue here. I'm going to continue here with a short continuation on human growth hormone, and then I wanted to answer a question about Prunella vulgaris, self-heal. So I want to get that out there. It's not really talking about endocrine herbs, but I want to mention it for sure because I found a very interesting paper from 2022, Chinese paper, and a lot of evidence here to support its empirical use. It's called self-heal. So I tell you what, I'm going to just stop what I was talking about with the endocrine system. We'll carry on next month. So next month will be part 3. I've got plenty more to talk about with adrenocorticotropic hormone and the adrenal cortex. Obviously, thyroid stimulating hormone. Lots of people have probably heard lots about that, but we'll re-go over that. And then for the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. That will wrap up the endocrine.
And all the herbs, all the adaptogen herbs that will
Yeah.
act on all those different hormones.
So Prunella vulgaris. Okay. I found a 2022, July 22 paper on the antiviral activity against human immunodeficiency virus and herpes simplex virus. The Chinese name for this plant is the European name, is a European herb, Prunella vulgaris. It grows a very prostate ground cover plant with beautiful purple flowers, pretty much opens in the spring and is gone by summer. So the Chinese name for it is wither in summer weed. So wither in the summer weed. It's antipyretic. It contains phenolics, triterpenoids, steroids, flavonoids, essential oils, polysaccharides, and then betulinic acid and prunellin and ursolic acid. This give it anti-tumoral activity. So both ursolic acid and rosmarinic acid are prevalent in it for the anti-tumor effects. Its main indications are for antioxidative effects, anti-inflammatory, anti-hypertensive, so bring down our blood pressure, antiviral, and antibacterial. They mentioned, and again, probably because it's Chinese research, viral particle and target cell are bound and facilitated by spike glycoproteins. Now, we've all been indoctrinated and brainwashed about spike proteins, so we don't need to describe those, but essentially that's how the virus manages to get entry to the cell. They've tested extracts of Prunella vulgaris, known as self-heal, against Ebola virus, Lassa virus, and avian influenza. And Prunella vulgaris extracts inactivated the virions and blocked viral attachment to host cells and consequently reduced infectivity. By the entry inhibition effect, by applying a treatment, they showed this against HIV, and I think this is certainly in vitro, but by applying the treatment of an extract of Prunella, in the first 5 hours of infection, they were able to inhibit further viral production and infection with HIV. So it effectively inhibits replication. It inhibits integrase, which is an enzyme involved in manufacturing the components that allow cells to bind to each other and therefore transfer the filthy contents to the host. And it showed inhibitory effects to interrupt the binding of SARS-CoV-2 glycoproteins to the receptors of the ACE2 expressing cells in a mutant SARS-CoV-2 pseudotyped HIV-1 base vector system, thus blocking cellular viral entry. So self-heal is everywhere, folks, and maybe some of you out there who are listening to it might want to look at self-heal a little more closely now that I've seen this paper on it. Anyway, let's see.
And what compound is antiviral?
Ursolic acid and rosmarinic acid, but there were other triterpenoids.
So would those be more alcohol soluble rather than water soluble? Because they're triterpenes.
Yes, they would 45% or there.
So extract in 45% ethanol rather than a tea. Yeah, but it has been traditionally used as a tea.
Okay, we're coming up to 2 minutes to the top of the hour, and I don't want to bogard the next show's time. So you've been listening to Ask Your Herb Doctor, KMUD 91.1 FM. Tonight's show was a discussion of the endocrine system, part 2, and how herbs can help modulate and regulate the body's hormones. My name's Andrew Murray.
My name's Sarah Johannesson Murray.
We're both licensed medical herbalists who consult with clients about a wide range of conditions. Our website is westernbotanicalmedicine.com. You may need to put HTTPS in front of that. You can visit our site to see a list of our organic herb tinctures, and our contact details are there. Alternatively, we can be reached toll-free 1-888-WBM-HERB. Our Western Botanical Medicine Twitter's account handle is at WBM-HERB. I'll get it right one day. We'll be posting future news regarding Ray Peat's work and the family's desires to keep it going in the future.
For generations to come.
Yeah, and links to both our Twitter and YouTube channels are also available on our website. Please join us again for Ask Your Herb Doctor next month, Friday, whatever the third Friday of March is. Can't imagine that at the moment, but thank you for listening and good night.
Thank you for listening. Good night.